you have to understand the bias, but it's not correct to like overstate it. People don't want the alleged news gathering turning into demoralization campaigns and propaganda, whereas they're actually, in many cases, okay with, being spun if it's honest. I think that's part of why like MSNBC and Fox do a lot better than CNN. And it's because CNN is sort of saying we're neutral, which everyone knows is not true. MSNBC is like, we're sort of the liberal network, and Fox is like, we're sort of the conservative network. You could still get a pretty clear view of like what news events have happened by watching either of these things.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Hope Axis. This is my 22nd episode in 7 months. I do take the timeline very seriously. We don't have that much time until hopelessness is everywhere. There's more and more need for talking more and more openly about what makes us hope. My method for solving this discourse problem is sitting down or standing up every week with some of my favorite people in the world who are smart, creative, prolific at something. They have expertise in something, and every day through their work prove that optimism gets you out of bed. And if you work really hard, you will end up building really cool things. Today, to prove this point, is my friend Max Meyer, who is the founder and editor of Arena magazine, an incredible new publication that exists both online and offline in the form of beautiful objects, right? We're back to the era of the published object, be that a Stripe Press book or an Asimov Press book or printed magazines. In Arena magazine, we learn about how America really works through the eyes of and experiences of the people who are actively building, and not just building opinions, but building products, companies, movements, organizations, sometimes even physical bodies through biotechnology and biotechnological innovation. And Arena magazine is a platform to make people more hopeful. So it's a privilege to be standing here with you, Max. Welcome to the Hope Axis. How are you doing, and what makes you hopeful today?
I'm doing great. The American people make me hopeful. I hate to start off so broadly, but I meet so many of them. I hear from them in all sorts of contexts, and against it all, they're the same people I grew up with and who've sort of conquered challenges for generations.
What are some of the things that the American people that you engage with as a journalist tell you that maybe surprise you, that sound to you either new or returning elements of life that we haven't heard about in a while, and now they're back?
I'm not sure that it's all that surprising. I think it would be surprising if you were sort of totally embedded in the sort of hopeless institutions, the ones that are sort of managerial or that the people sense are sort of strangling the culture or whatnot. And so, if you were deeply embedded in one of these universities, then you might be surprised at how sort of intelligent and resourceful people throughout the country are, or the types of things that they consider very important. You might not hear about these things on political cable television, but people are really generous and really hopeful and really optimistic in certain ways, and even in places that are a bit slower or have had less economic opportunity over the years. And I think that they crave the same things that Americans always have since Alexis de Tocqueville sort of described democracy in America, which is participating in different things, building institutions at the micro level, at the much bigger level. Americans are Americans, and it's a behavioral thing that has brought so many different groups of people into the American umbrella.
I have a Tocqueville reading group on Interintellect, and we meet every month and have these incredible discussions. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are hosting a lot of interesting projects on Interintellect. This is my baby project. I use my own platform as a host, the same way as you write for Arena magazine as a writer. I think founders should always stay in founder mode and kind of stay close to the product. And I'm having a blast. It's such an incredible thing to just sit there, with this group of Americans, basically, or people living in America, and hear how deeply Tocqueville resonates. Something from the early 1800s. The core has not changed since then. Compared with many other countries, America's founding principles are very much alive and well and parts of the everyday discourse and everyday self-identification of people.
Right. Well, I always think it's very interesting that if you go throughout the sort of, it's not really a countryside in the U.S. Countryside is more of a sort of European concept. But if you go to the middle, to the sort of random places in the U.S., the sort of like fidelity to American principles is sometimes very shocking. I mean, you hear about like in France, farmers that can recite Flaubert or different French poets. I mean, you have like American farmers and country folks that know the Constitution and worship the Constitution as an object. You see this in a very acute way with sort of Second Amendment culture in the United States. People who understand the ideology behind the revolution, people who understand the sort of the provenance of their rights and their relationship to the government. And that's something that I think would be, is slightly shocking to some of the intellectuals who consider the country cultures to be sort of bumpkiny.
What makes people in cities forget their own democratic norms?
Ideological tilt. It's an 80-20 environment, and so it's like the most extreme version of this, being like, Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard University and MIT are. It's like, over 90% blue. The Republicans are the heretics, and it can lead people to believe, crazy things because they don't know anyone. And the same thing can happen in the reverse. You could have Republicans that live in extremely rural counties who would be like, they might not know a single person who's planning to vote Democrat, and they'll use that as a lens to say, like, I can't imagine that any Democrat would win votes. No one that I know is voting for voting for Kamala. No one that I know is voting for Joe Biden. Whereas the Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's sort of on the other end. No one I know is voting for Trump.
And then, surprise, the results come in, and you ask yourself, who are these people? Are we even in the same country? And what does it mean to be an American? A little bit of kind of leaving your pocket universe would have solved it. There are a lot of arguments calling for Americans to just travel around America, rent a car. It's cheaper than a lot of other holidays. And you guys have a lot of good stuff in America. To quote Tim Marshall, in terms of real estate, this is winning the lottery to have America to drive. Yeah. You should check out the different places and talk to people.
I think many Americans would benefit from sort of putting down the even LAX to SFO and driving, seeing the places in between. I call them the places between places.
Yes.
You sort of have one place and it's like a little archipelago, and they sort of like elite tech finance consulting version of America. There are like 5 cities to live in or something like that. And it's like an archipelago. And I mean, we say flyover country because it's, but even like, even Chicago is sort of flyover country at this point. It's like when the sort of elites of the elites sense that the prestige has been sucked out of a place, they tend to totally ignore it. Mm-hmm. Chicago is sort of like a portal to another time in America, as like the only big city comparable to New York in terms of sustained urban buildup. And it's just super fascinating because it does not feel at all like New York, except it has the same geography, the same sort of planning, the same feeling of the buildings. It's like a totally different portal.
I mean, 2 things that to me seem uniquely and distinctly American. One is to not necessarily just concentrate into existing hubs, but to want to aggressively build a new hub. Right? All of these hubs that we are talking about today, were the work of other people who went there,
Yes.
Often because everything else was too saturated and they were looking for new frontiers, literally sometimes, and sometimes intellectually. I was recently meditating on like how Hollywood came to be. because, all these Eastern European and Central European immigrants had to go and take their megalomania somewhere. And in many ways, the only thing that they could go into were culture and real estate. And where those two things meet, well, building studio lots and kind of industrializing it, right? Had there been a Napoleonic War for them, they would have probably become, excellent war planners. I mean, maybe it's too soon to talk about war plans. So soon after the signal incident yesterday. But I think it's a really good. I think it's an important note. The other thing that to me seems distinctly American is that in this country, you can actually get into your car and go to a completely different place in a different time zone, different climate, different language, different tradition, different year of joining the union, etc., and talk to people. People are actually happy to. I mean, I've as the founder of Interact, I have witnessed many such encounters. Bringing together people from really, really different backgrounds, and Americans are really happy to hear about another corner in America. There's a stranger culture here, so to speak, and that's actually not necessarily the same in. I mean, I'm Hungarian. This is not necessarily the same within Hungary. I lived in France. It's not necessarily the same in France. There are a lot of prejudices, a lot of tribalism that, yes, America has tribalism, but the European one is very different. I lived in England. I lived in Portugal. I don't know if a random Portugal or Portuguese person would be that open to walking into a random bar in the completely opposite end of the country and find the same kind of openness and willingness to share political opinions, how the people live, seeing the photos of their kids, etc., etc. So there's so much to capitalize on in this beautiful country when it comes to people's openness and willingness to engage and to join. So I really, really love that note. Chicagoans, wherever you live, people travel around.
Well, if you think about it, everyone in the United States is descended from someone who left somewhere. Of course, in the beginning, it's Englishmen and sort of Protestant minority groups, and then you have these various other groups, and it bears out in all of the sort of social and economic studies. Americans move more. Americans end up a little bit further away from where they grew up, typically. There are certain places where that's not as true. Certain communities in the U.S. where it's more like the average is to live 20 miles away from where you grew up or something, or 20 miles away from your mother. Americans are movers, and it really is baked into the culture that you can just sort of get up and leave. And that was very arduous in the early days of the sort of frontier days. People dying on the frontier. I think people underestimate the completion of the national highway system under President Eisenhower as one of the most fundamental sort of cultural shifts in the US, was that we literally opened up the roads to individuals. That was the first time where you could really sort of go out on your own without a serious risk of dying from some disease or needing to use a train or whatnot. Being able to get in your car and do it, and connecting these sort of far-flung places is it's an economic revolution, and it's like the opening of a new. It's sort of a new frontier at that point in the middle of the 20th century. I sort of joke that you had another sort of frontier opening when they decided to move from Manhattan into Brooklyn, and people started moving to the other boroughs of New York. Gentrification like this is sort of a new frontier. People are always looking for some sort of either technological or sort of collective edge. Moving to Brooklyn could be one of those. Moving higher in the sky into the skyscrapers. Moving to sort of satellite communities outside of these places. You had a little bit of a is there a frontier in 2020 of Montana or Texas leaving Silicon Valley?
You agree with that? Were the COVID people right?
Well, they were right that it was a frontier, and sometimes on the frontier you get bit in the ass, and the frontier hits back. It's not just some lackadaisical adventure. It's real stuff, and people realized, oh, I don't quite like it here. I'd rather go back to the place that I know. And some people figured it out fully, and their lives are like very different from what they were in 2019 to now.
A Million Ways to Die in the West. There was this movie with Seth MacFarlane. I really liked it. It's just these people living on the frontier, and everything wants to kill you, basically. Where you step out of the house, or you even just stay inside, and something will kill you. This is really, really interesting, and this idea, of course, about the hypomanic edge and the fact that the people who come to America, either themselves or their ancestors, have migrated, have overcome, have had to reinvent themselves, figure things out. So I really, really like that. I really like that note. Do you think that technologists today are somehow closer to the sentiment of the average American, if we can still talk about the average American, the median American? We hear a lot of criticisms about, elite media institutions and how they exercise their discourse, and how removed that might be from the real guy living somewhere, in the Midwest, somewhere in America. Whereas technologists seem to be, creating more and more oral tradition around the real needs that, might just emerge from their data, the requests that they are getting, the actual numbers. And I'm really curious what you think about that, and whether you think that technology in this sense is a new kind of sociological frontier.
Well, for what it's worth, I don't consider the Midwest to be more America than California or New York. If New York isn't America, sort of begging the question, can anything ever be America? I don't subscribe to that. I don't subscribe to that view.
America is always somewhere else.
Yeah, there is such a thing as like a median American, though. But there are median Americans that work in tech companies. There are median Americans that hate tech companies. There are median Americans that love tech companies. I think that, like many other institutions, much of the tech world went nuts and decided to be very sort of disloyal to the country over the course of the 2010s, where it's sort of like, we're going to control the population, we're going to censor them, we're going to refuse to cooperate with the military, we're going to sort of build our own bubble in Silicon Valley and hope to just lift ourselves up from the rest of the country. I think that they've definitely reverted a bit back to the norm, which is that there's going to be sort of synthesis between the state, private industry, the citizenry. And I think they realized, in part because of the Trump Part 1 and Trump Part 2, that permanent hatred of the citizenry actually can be sort of voted on. The tech companies were sort of surprised by that.
Maybe we can talk about a pre-Trump tech company and a post-Trump tech company, right? Maybe the two things don't even mean the same thing anymore. You and I both are, readers of the Technological Republic book that Alex Karp has just published, the CEO of Palantir, co-founder of Palantir. And I'm really curious what you think about this book, for those who are not familiar with your review in Arena magazine, and whether you think that Karp's call for a return to a more patriotic and nation-focused way of conducting tech businesses is one of the solutions to this problem.
Well, I thought it was an excellent book. I thought it described almost perfectly the sort of thing that I describe, which is the tech culture thinking that it can be above and sort of without the American culture, when in reality it really is like, you're in this country and you can try to go build these things. You could try to go build these things elsewhere. I would not bet on success there, and I think that the companies have come back around. But I mean, what Karp basically paints is that the tech culture is basically the city on a hill version of what the American culture broadly should be, which is empowered citizens who can take risks, be accountable to the risks, but get the outsized returns of the risks. And that part of the reason why the dream of building a startup became so infectious for much of the young smart population is that it was an opportunity to be empowered as a citizen in a way that feels more like a reach in politics because the institutions are against you, or that feels like when the sort of like traditional American dream feels a little bit more out of reach. The sort of high agency, high accountability, high reward, high risk tech world is exciting. But I think it's not quite as trite as just the companies need to be patriotic. If anything, it's also a lesson for the country that we should see what is successful about Google. What is successful about Google that allows it to be worth trillions of dollars? What is successful about Facebook that allows it to be worth trillions of dollars? It's not that they're running some scam or exploiting people. That's sort of the like socialist message. And there's a temptation on certain parts of the right, sort of populist right, to paint a picture that the wealth has been created dishonestly or in an exploitative way, when in reality it's just sort of like smart people getting together with excellent organizational cultures that allow them to build things that work. And we can learn a lot from this as a country. I think that was sort of the lesson that a lot of people would not have maybe predicted in the book. It felt obvious in retrospect, but yeah, I think it was worth saying that like the broader culture has a lot to learn from what worked in this one little wacky part of the world, which is Silicon Valley.
What are your feelings about DOGE? I mean, it's a big grand experiment on this, right? To bring the startup culture to governance in some sense. I mean, not necessarily in a way that Karp would approve of. I have no information about this, but some of his suggestions in the book, which I agree is really, really good, are far more careful and kind of circumspect when it comes to the players and the past and the tradition and the Chesterton's fence. But nevertheless, there is some kind of similarity between the two missions.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that Karp finished the book a year ago, and so it was sort of pre-Doge even existing as a concept. And it's true, he doesn't mention it in the book. He did say on television a few days after the book came out that he supports Doge, and so do I. Yeah, I think it's basically when the reality of Washington has become that the sort of political leadership, especially under a Republican president, is neutered and is not actually allowed to exercise the executive authority to which they're entitled under the Constitution, and is actually just being suppressed by a managerial and bureaucratic culture, then there is this sort of like beautiful rebellion in terms of the Doge kids and Musk as an advisor to Trump. And it's sort of unclear whether all of the things that they're working on are going well. But I think that was just sort of baked in, that they were gonna try things and that they were going to iterate very quickly and land on some good stuff. And it would be sort of a revolution if even a slice of what they've been working on ends up sticking, just because it will have been the first time that people were sent in to cut and actually allowed to cut. And you see all of the protestations of this of Doge are sort of ironic. Chuck Schumer said, "We all believe in efficiency." No, he doesn't. And he said, "But you need to do it through Congress," which means don't do it. It's sort of imposing a process to guarantee that it never gets done, while ironically saying that you actually agree with it. If he actually agreed with it, he wouldn't disagree with the way that they're doing it. He doesn't agree. He doesn't, and so he sort of says, "We all agree about efficiency. We all agree that we should cut waste." Point out a single instance, and he's like lighting his hair on fire. And so I'm both pro Doge and I'm anti Doge, because I can't stand the idea that no one should ever be allowed to cut anything, especially considering that much of the nonsense was instituted without the American people having a vote in the first place.
What can go wrong? Do you see any? Because, when it comes to military, innovation, what things can go wrong are very clear, right? Annie Jacobson has an amazing book on it called Nuclear War: A Scenario. When it comes to reshuffling governmental institutions, even when that is being done by some of the smartest people around, or some of the people with the best and most convincing experience in the startup world, for you personally, as a leader of an institution yourself, both media company and the magazine, what do you see the risks being that would come from the activity itself and not imposed from the Schumers of the world from the outside?
Oh, I mean, I think you sort of see it in the, there were some people at the Department of Energy who look after the nuclear stockpile who were offered buyouts who probably should not have, and they corrected it a few days later. But I think that the downsides are almost always intentionally overstated. Take the example of the Center for Disease Control. Arguably, if it had been DOGed pre-pandemic and you got rid of a few of the people who were sort of the most deliberate and calculating liars who intended to basically put a fraud on the American people, they were very experienced. And one man's like protecting the downside risk is another man's getting rid of people whose sort of seniority was a real issue. I mean, yeah, that's sort of unrelated to all the other like pandemic discussions, but just like the pure issue of like the people who were the most senior in the government decided to change their last 30 years of opinions on whether or not tiny little cloth masks can stop the spread of respiratory viruses. So under the DOGE framework, if you fire a bunch of people at the CDC, you're actually leaving us unprepared for the next pandemic. Whereas I sort of look at it and I don't feel like they're prepared. I feel like they're going to do some risky research to start another one, or I feel like they're going to lie about it. And so maybe my answer is that we underestimate how badly a lot of these things are going, and the like downsides that are being stated are distractions from that. I would say the same thing about some of the scientific funding, to be honest. I'm inclined to support a lot of scientific research. What if we're underestimating how unproductive a lot of the NIH processes have become? Does the University of Pennsylvania really need to collect a very high double-digit percentage of NIH money in administrative overhead? You cannot convince me that this is like a civilizational crisis if they have to reduce their administrative count and actually give the money to the scientific projects instead, because I see what they're doing. And so I think that that's sort of one of the things about DOGE is that the opponents want to sort of defend the thing that they're cutting in principle without addressing any of the things in practice. Foreign aid, classic example. It's like we can all argue for foreign aid in principle. And then in practice, if you point out that this is not foreign aid, it's just political activities, then they don't want to address the specifics there. If you say, of course, we support scientific funding. Do I support mandating, diversity bureaucrats as a part of the scientific package? I can point out clearly that that's not science. And so there's like a lie about what's actually being funded. And I think that is like, whether or not the DOGE stuff succeeds, having exposed all of that is just a tremendous service to the country. And there are some people who disagree with the idea of focusing on sort of like, today we canceled a $10 million grant for XYZ, focusing on the sort of small potato things. But it's not just about the sort of total budget or the total amount of spending. There are ways in which small amounts of money can be weaponized. And when tens of millions of dollars can pay for many, many full-time political activists throughout the country to sort of do anarchist stuff, that's much more damaging than like losing billions of dollars on defense waste, frankly. You could do a lot more damage with $50 million funding political interference than the damage caused by sort of extra debt. And we're going to, I think, very successfully wipe some of that out over the course of the next 2 years with DOGE. And so I remain positive, even understanding the arguments about some of the stuff that's been done in maybe a ham-handed way.
Say more about foreign aid, because the most convincing, and I don't mean to dwell too much on this topic, but you're a journalist.
No, I'd love to.
You're the ideal person to have a multi-layered conversation with about this topic. So some of the most convincing arguments that I've heard from people who are, in many cases, absolutely pro this government, but maybe apprehensive about some of the DOGE experiments, not expecting everything to go perfectly, but still, you can be still apprehensive about certain details, would bring up foreign aid as one of those murky territories where, if we just want to reduce the suffering of innocent people, that might not be always taken into account. And the second order effects might be huge. Do you think that that's something that they think about? Is that something that, is a political taboo? Our democracies rest on an idea of care, and, that might violate that ideal.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people would basically say that it's not a question of U.S. responsibility at this point, given how much of the sort of economic load the country has borne for so long. I don't actually subscribe to that. I'm more concerned about the things that are actually just not foreign aid. So like USAID, I think most people, their understanding of it is it's like bags of flour and sugar and potatoes and other food going to poor countries. That's one
vaccinations, hospital beds.
Vaccinations is fine. I think that one is, they're protecting all of that. There is a serious argument as to whether the United States should permanently fund, for example, HIV clinics in South Africa, the government of which is sort of aggressively hostile to U.S. foreign policy interests at this point. How do you balance whether we have to do that? The GDP of South Africa is definitely high enough to pay for the aid that we give them. That's sort of just like a classic, does this country deserve our foreign aid? The real thing that I'm pointing out, though, is that many of the USAID contracts were actually just sort of political sinecures for activists in countries all over Europe. You will never find a USAID contract for an organization that is like suing a European government to protect free speech rights. But you will find USAID contracts for organizations that are lobbying European governments to crack down on free speech rights. There was this thing called Internews that was sort of allegedly a journalist training network. It was paying left-wing outlets. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. There was a very funny contract where it was, supposed to be combating misinformation, and it turned out that the awardee of the grant was doing a misinformation all over the place. This was like a Jordanian media outlet that was promoting false information about the Israeli military, and the U.S. was underwriting this. And so that is something that's appropriate for a private foundation to support if they want. It is a violation of the American taxpayer to say that we're forced to fund that, and that if we defund the sort of political operations being run under foreign aid, that we also are going to be bullied for taking away vaccinations. I actually put it on the government that decided to fuse these things in order to use the moral cudgel of vaccinations and sickness to demand that we permanently subsidize non-governmental organizations that are basically outsourcing left-wing political power and then underwriting them. And you would find that in many cases, USAID or these other government agencies basically act as the growth funding for NGOs that have been started at the seed level by philanthropists. Start it for $5 million and then lobby to get $50 million in public money to expand your mission, basically. It's fair game. That's my opinion. And I'm not willing to, I'm willing to say, unless the government is willing to separate the political stuff from the health stuff, I'm willing to get close to the edge and say we're going to target all of it in order to get rid of the nonsense and get rid of the political stuff. I wasn't the one who said we're going to combine left-wing political activism with a vaccine program in XYZ country. And if you oppose the political activism, then you hate the people in that country. I'm willing to say we're going to target all of it because I don't accept the framing that these two are part of the same category. And I think that was a very clever thing to do, because now when the right targets the political activism, the left can accuse it of hating the poor, hating foreigners or whatnot, when in reality, we're trying to dissociate these two things and say, let's do foreign aid in the traditional sense that people understand it, not foreign political interference or foreign social activism?
In European countries, and I'm not fully sure how this is in the US, so I'm really happy to learn about it. It is the state's responsibility to some degree to, if not fund, but enable various political entities to operate and compete, right? So in that logic, it would...
What do you mean political entities, like parties or?
Parties, organizations. So in that logic, whether the American government happens to be more right or more left in any given term, it is indeed its duty to not discriminate on the political basis. So from my European logic, I don't see any issue with funding actually going to left-wing political interests, because the government of the United States represents everybody, which means that it represents both sides. So it cannot just, fund things that happen to 100% politically aligned with it, with the exception of, entities that are actively trying to harm America via military activity, financial subterfuge, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very murky. But just because somebody is left-wing, they do not disqualify from...
No, it doesn't.
They
No,
want
it's not.
Fair and square contracts.
No, you make a very good point. And I'm not saying that we should disqualify anyone who's left-wing from ever getting a government contract. I'm saying that when the people vote, the power that they invest in the president and in the Congress actually matters, and there cannot be mechanisms to permanently protect left-wing political interests to make sure that they permanently get money. I'm saying the people should be able to vote to take it away. They shouldn't be forced to fund it. They should be able to fund whatever they want.
No, they fund contracts that were won, and the same way as they don't vote every day, they vote every 4 years, the same way contracts can expire, and different governmental entities can decide not to renew them if they find a problem with it. No, like that would be
absolutely
the normal bureaucratic.
But that's what's being protested, is that they're declining to renew contracts.
Yeah.
And now these groups are suing to say, actually, we think the law requires that you give us money next year and the year after and 20 years from now. Well, that's the argument.
Yeah, that's
what they're doing.
How it goes. Yeah, that I completely understand.
And for example, I'll how about something closer to home? We fund universities. I don't agree that the First Amendment requires taxpayers to permanently fund to the tune of billions far left departments that are not engaged in academics. I think it's actually within the purview of the people. And at the local level, it's much more connected. The elections are every 2 years. If they elect their state representatives and the state representatives say, we actually don't want to fund a department that's encouraging terrorism against the United States or that is engaged in science denial with the gender stuff or whatnot, I don't think that the people are forced to fund it under the general principles. I want to see variation. And so it's like California can put its money to whatever it wants. Really what I'm saying is that I think the status quo that we're in is that left-wing governments are always allowed to add stuff, and right-wing governments trying to take some of that stuff away is always framed as either discrimination or norms violation. Whereas my only concept is if a sort of left-wing thing was created by executive power alone, it should clearly be able to be undone by executive power alone. Whereas if the Congress wanted to write a law that says, we want to give exactly $525 million to this far left group every year from here to infinity, that's a very specific thing that they can do, and I would be powerless to stop it. I would, the president could not go in and say, I disagree. He can try to, but if the Congress overrides him, then that's the law. But what's actually happened is that Congress sets aside this money for sort of vague purposes. The president and his administration decide how to implement it. And the hair on fire moment that we're having right now is that it's the first time that a conservative administration has actually tried to have a say in how we're spending the money. And that is, and again, it's sort of like the Cambridge, Massachusetts thing. When you're used to a 90-10 political environment, the guy with 10% having an opinion strikes you as unfair because they don't think they live in a 50-50 country. They don't think that conservative voters should be able to have a say. And it's like, imagine how controversial it would be for USAID to send money to a foreign religious charity or a religious organization or something, it'd be like, we send them to foreign religious organizations all the time. It's just secular religious organizations that are sort of, left-wing social stuff. And so I think that the allergic reaction that's happening right now is just, it's the first time in a while that there's been a charismatic group of conservative people that are actually asserting their ideas. And
Yeah.
I, for one, support it because I think it's more likely to help us reset to a level where we decide to take some of the political power out of these things. I would love to see the Congress say, maybe we should reduce the total amount of money that we're awarding to these political organizations because it's totally crushed trust in the United States. I think in order to do that, you have to threaten to do it the other way.
I think in most EU countries, any support for political organizations depends on the numbers of people that support them, party memberships.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is
You can't
unique.
just say like, "Hey, I'm a political organization. Give me money every year." That's a terrible idea. You have to show that this giant mass of people supports you, and you have to keep winning them over. So I'm really curious. Like, I want people to have more say in their own affairs and a more, direct experience of democracy. And I will want to see in the next couple of years what the data shows. I mean, it's a huge experiment, right? We don't know. We have assumptions and preferences and values, and we take sides, and then the data will speak for itself as long as it's clean and true.
I totally agree, and I wish that were the case, but that's just sort of not part of the Washington culture at this point. One of the most famous things where the Environmental Protection Agency is now trying to claw back this money. There was a group called Power Forward Communities it had never received any federal money before. It had like $100 in receipts. And then all of a sudden, in the last 60 days of the Biden administration, it was awarded one of the largest contracts of all time, in excess of $2 billion, basically to help underserved communities buy eco-friendly appliances for their homes. This sounds fine as a private charity, but I object to it using my money, and I don't consider it like an insane violation of norms to say, actually, we're gonna try to claw this back. This is an inappropriate use. And again, the most ridiculous thing about it was that the organization hitherto had $100 in receipts, and then all of a sudden it's now prepared to execute on billions of dollars worth of federal contracts. It's not credible. I would almost rather that the money go directly to some larger corrupt organization, because at least they can do something with the money. But like a tiny little corrupt organization that's never done anything, it's just ridiculous.
They would have already done something if they could have. I mean, especially in America, where you have this uniquely, beautifully developed culture of philanthropy, right? There's a tradition of flexing your dollars via building hospitals, far greater than in Europe, where, to go back to Tocqueville, everybody's waiting around for the government to build. This country, you actually have really, really wealthy people who socially and in terms of taxation greatly benefit from donating their wealth wherever they want. Like, go and do that.
But the model that Soros sort of pioneered, which was very, very genius, was start a small organization and bankroll it for the first few years and try to spin it as a government contractor eventually to take those sort of government grants. Because even the richest people, the government can always give more money because they can print it.
So a kind of co-option. I want to talk a little bit about the fake news thing and go back there. You come from the Stanford Review. You run a media organization, the Intergalactic Media Corporation. Just a no big deal name, right? Not at all going intergalactic right away. Maybe it will be the first magazine on Mars. And of course, Arena magazine. What do you see as the hope for journalism? I mean, you're a traditional journalist, right? You do have this incredible newsletter, Love Letters for America, and we will talk about it a little bit. For the 4th of July, the great anniversary, 250 letters will be published. I hope to write one of the Love Letters to America. I love this place. But you are working on, online magazines, print magazine, a book now. Why this relatively conservative way of doing things, and how do you see your own duty in clarifying some of this fog of traditional taboo. I don't even know what to say, like a network of taboos that have developed in this tradition. Where are you there? How did you get involved? And what do you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, I consider myself more of like a storyteller versus a journalist. I think that there's a very important thing that remains in the court of the journalists, which is professional news gathering. Figuring out what's happening is still something that I'm interested in. I don't want to be like a news gatherer where I go out and figure out, I mean, Bloomberg has, thousands of professional financial journalists whose job is to figure out what's going on all day long. Reuters has thousands around the world whose job is to figure out what's going on all day long and put them out on the wires. The New York Times, CNN, CNN can send anywhere in the world, anyone anywhere in the world very quickly. If anything happens on any continent, they'll have someone there in a few hours to report on it. And this is very valuable. And it's unfortunate that some of these organizations are biased, but it's not that bad if they're a little bit biased if you know how to read them. And so like an informed news consumer can read the news reports of the New York Times or CNN and understand when they're being spun, but that it's still super relevant for retrieving information. The sort of arena thesis.
Kind of the Hanania argument as well. Like we talked about Hanania before I switched on the record button, and he was on the podcast just before you, because he also I love journalists because you guys write the best novels and I want to read good novels. But he has a different argument. He has a moral argument for it.
Yeah, I agree with him that the journalists, even when they're biased, you have to understand the bias, but it's not correct to like overstate it. They're biased, and in many cases think they're doing the best job they can to remove that bias. And sometimes it sort of shines through. If you ever see a sort of mainstream journalist writing about a religious topic, they're sort of oblivious and proud of it, or judgmental and proud of it. When they're talking about Trump, obviously there's a lot of bias, but you would not be sort of better served in terms of your like view of reality if you totally forswear all of these things and just rely on opinion posters. I think there's sort of peril in that. But for what it's worth, most Americans do not need to be very elaborately caught up on all of the like political drama that takes place. And part of the reaction to bias in the media is just a desire for more straightforward storytelling, stuff that makes them feel good. And that is one thing that is sort of incorrigible about the news gathering media as it is there's just no incentive for them to ever be nice about anything. And they consider it sort of a violation of their principles to say anything nice about the country. It's and so sort of one of the inspirations for Arena in the first place is that I think the tech media is like much worse than the rest of the media. Like I would gladly defend the sort of New York Times, Bloomberg, political and financial reporters, where it's like the tech journalists in many cases just like completely biased, lying, or they're too stupid to understand what isn't real. And they're always attacking things because they're sort of like a parasite that attaches onto this other thing. People don't want the alleged news gathering turning into demoralization campaigns and propaganda, whereas they're actually, in many cases, okay with, being spun if it's honest. I think that's part of why, MSNBC and Fox do a lot better than CNN, and it's because CNN is sort of saying we're neutral, which everyone knows is not true. MSNBC is like, we're sort of the liberal network, and Fox is like, we're sort of the conservative network. You could still get a pretty clear view of like what news events have happened by watching either of these things. And there are certain people where it's like very, very biased, but people appreciate that it's slightly more honest.
This is so interesting. I remember I lived in London and the Evening Standard during the elections ran the front page with David Cameron and how they support David Cameron. And it was so interesting and kind of shocking to me that, they are so out in the open about their bias. And they explain why. But people are biased, right? We don't expect media outlets to show us some kind of scientific AI-vetted truth.
Yeah.
Unless we are actually talking about scientific AI-vetted truth, in which case, please give me the scientific truth. In all other cases, what you want is you want to feel like you're in the marketplace and David
Yeah.
Brooks is saying one thing and you kind of know where he's coming from. And then this other guy is saying something else. And then she says something else. And you're an adult. Like that's what adulting feels like. Everything with a pinch of salt, knowing that it's from the cacophony, the noise, in a good sense, that the truth might arise. I mean, that is democracy, right? People come in, they don't know each other. They shout their own points. They tell you where they are coming from and where their biases are coming from. Like, I'm a mother of 7 children, so I think people have kids. Yeah, I want to hear about kids from a woman who has had 7 kids. Yes.
Well, yeah, I think what people dislike and distrust is the sort of like, I am completely neutral and have no opinions. Trump is Hitler. Like that is like where the disconnect is. Whereas I think people can appreciate the sort of straightforward stating, this is where my opinion comes from, and this is how it informs how I'm delivering the facts to you. And some of them Axios has done pretty well over the course of the last 2 years. Axios sold for $500 million. And that was sort of based on, let's fuse the like fact-based stuff and then just say like, oh, and by the way, this is what I personally think. And they've had some incidents where it's like totally biased or whatnot, but in general, it's a lot better because they're sort of encouraging the clear communication up front. I think that has a lot of promise.
And we need in-depth exploration in the era of TikTok, right? We need, the Zelensky video that just happened with Trump. One of my close friends, Julia Zonevand, she teaches kind of media memory or mediatized memory at the new school. And she, sat down with her students to watch the whole 50 minutes and then had a discussion with them. And she told me that most of her students, have never seen something 50 minutes long. They just have not. They don't watch things that are more than 2 minutes long. And, this is where I'm bullish on education, where I'm bullish on great explanatory journalism, that there are things worth spending one's time on and staying with the topic. And a good writer, whether that's a novelist, whether that's a TV presenter, a good stand-up comedian, or a good journalist, storyteller, invites you to spend the time with him or her until you really deeply understand something. And that will stay with you forever. That cures cultural amnesia.
Yeah. I guess I'm inclined to discount some of the fear about the way that people are changing the way they consume information, just because I know the history of like people being worried about books, then people being worried about newspapers, then people being worried about the radio, TV, social media. The way that people consume information is always changing. I guess maybe there's something that's arguably a lot worse about the sort of short form TikTok, Instagram based stuff for like political consumption.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that these things have a natural way of correcting themselves. And like, if you had been listening to like the short Instagram videos on TikTok, you would have thought that like Taylor Swift endorsing Kamala Harris was like the end of the election. There were going to be like tens of millions of extra voters that like came out to vote. And then, Trump clobbered them. And so I think that these, you can't hide from reality that long. And I guess I'm sort of optimistic in the long run about these things self-correcting, just because reality has its ways.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and I'm not at all. You know me. I'm a tech CEO, so I'm not a Luddite in any way.
Oh, I'm a techno-Luddite.
I want pluralism. I want the short form, and I want. This is what's happening in publishing. The beautiful process of books and of magazines becoming objects, and people saying like, okay, I could get this content, from my phone in a couple of minutes. If I'm going to bother keeping this, then write me something timeless that I will want to revisit, make really, really good quality, and make it beautiful. If that's not a renaissance, I don't know what is.
No, the studies basically show people are unwilling at this point to pay for news by and large. Almost no Americans will pay for news. You have a very small number that are subsidizing the subscription-based news outlets that do exist. They'll pay for other stuff. The objects that sort of define our lives will continue to be valuable, I think. Although it's definitely not going to be true forever that Americans are going to want to pay like $30 for like a low quality book just because it's been marketed by celebrities or whatnot. And so like the current publishing industry, it's like the goal is like, let's print it at as low a quality as we possibly can, sell it at as high a margin as we can, because we're losing 50% to the distributors and networks and whatnot. Yeah, the businesses are always changing. And what's sort of funny about the TikTok thing is that a lot of people at this point would point to TikTok as the reason why Barnes and Noble is doing well, and the reason why like certain publishers are doing very well is because there are entire networks that have been unlocked on TikTok, sort of this book talk idea for sharing books. And that's another reason to be hopeful is that capitalism finds a way. I'm not sure if you've seen like Reese Witherspoon's like book club. So she does this book club, very popular, and part of the genius of it is that she also signs with these authors for her movie production company to get the rights to do the movies. And so they do the books, they send them to the bestseller list, they turn them into movies. There are a lot of people with like sort of a paternalistic view who would think that this is like bad because it's not organic or whatnot. But it actually is like, it's making it very viable for a lot of authors to do well. They're turning them into movies. And I think that it's one of these, like, you can like protest people's tastes and people's likes. That's not going to work for too long. You can find creative ways to like meet people where they are. And that's something that's sort of also inspiring, is that like people's voting with their feet, voting with their dollars is a very, very powerful mechanism to correct these things. This new Disney remake of Snow White opened over the weekend, and they're going to lose a fortune on that. And Americans don't want it. And despite it sort of being shoved down their throat, it's like Disney is acting like it's 10 years ago. This is a remake of Snow White where the lead actress is on record saying that the story of Snow White is awful and needs to be changed. And they had all this political nonsense in the lead up to the film, and it totally bombed at the box office. You had empty theaters all over the country. They spent $250 million making this movie, and it grossed $43 million in the United States over the weekend.
What's the difference between how that came to be versus Wicked?
Well, Wicked was excellent. There was no sort of like nonsense political marketing in the lead up to Wicked. That's my opinion. I happen to love Wicked the musical and Wicked the movie. It was very positive. One of my favorite reviews of Wicked, which is also a very positive review, was done by Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is like a huge musical guy. His father composed musicals. Yeah, I don't think that. I mean, if they had been out there doing Wicked as like, it wasn't that into the identity politics stuff. You can have diverse movies. America is a diverse country.
Yeah.
But like, if the actress that you're presenting as like the picture of diversity is also like Snow White is evil, screw white people, and all this other nonsense, then it's like you can't force that on people. My friend Alana Newhouse, the editor of Tablet, one of my favorite essays ever, she did this thing called "Everything is Broken," and this is basically an essay about institutional drift, but how every time she has this great sentence where every time the American people are asked to sort of ratify these cultural dictates, they run in the opposite direction. And so it's like Snow White remake being forced on down their throats. They're like, no, we vote against this. Amazon trying to crack down on like Gone with the Wind on Amazon. It was like people ran toward it. They don't want to be told what to do. They want stuff that they like being sort of put in front of them. And there is a strong capitalist monetary force on the companies to do this. It's not just like the fact. It's not just the fact that like
It's so funny, and there's this beautiful kind of structural paradox where, to go back to the very, very good Reese Witherspoon book club example, where the more you give the power to the people to decide for themselves and discuss it among themselves and create user-generated content and decide whether they like something or not, the more you will benefit by owning the entire infrastructure. Right?
Yep.
And Hollywood has always been ahead of the game when it comes to this, like owning the whole production cycle. Right?
Yeah, but I think that in the old media world, they could have a PR firm plot out a new actor and like make them a star overnight, and that type of stuff just doesn't work anymore. Social media has helped a lot, actually. The people are able to express their thoughts. They're not relying on network news all the time to tell them who they're supposed to admire. I mean, there are some people that could argue that this is, I have no ill will. This is sort of what they tried to do with Kamala Harris. They tried to do sort of like a PR campaign
Top
to
down.
tell us who she was. And it's like, actually, people have the expectation that you behave in a different way, which is we expect you to go on Joe Rogan's show. We expect you to do unscripted talks. We expect you to do long form interviews.
That's what Gavin Newsom is doing now, right? Like going.
Newsom is very good at it.
Yeah.
And at least Newsom is in a way levying the greatest insult that one could against this sort of like previous Democratic strategy of hiding out by doing all of this. He's doing the Trump stuff. And some of it's a little cringy, but it's like,
it's supposed to be cringy.
Yes, exactly.
Cringy. You're supposed to be embarrassing yourself in ways. This is so interesting. I want to talk before we run out of time. I just want to talk about the next arena issue and what it's going to be about. And also a little bit about this event that we are organizing together, just so that people save the date. And then we will do an outro that I always do with people on my podcast. So Max, tell us about the next Arena Magazine issue, who will be in it, what it will be about, and why people should get super, super excited about it.
Well, we haven't announced it fully yet, but I'll give a little bit of a preview. The issue is going to be about warfare and conflict and the technology of war. We have some great historical pieces. We have some great pieces that are leaning into science and technology. We have some great pieces that are leaning into sort of political questions and geopolitical questions. And then some that are speculative, sci-fi-esque, predictive. It's a subject that a lot of people are interested in the United States right now. And the tech world has sort of seen this transformation over the course of the last decade, from Google very famously saying, we will work with the Chinese government, we will not work with the US military, to the entire tech sector sort of embracing the idea of building stuff for American defense. We're talking about big companies, we're talking about small companies. And I guess our event will be bringing together some of these writers and people who are interested in the magazine to discuss it. It's going to be our second coast to coast American propaganda tour.
I love it. And save the date, our listeners and viewers, for May the 10th in San Francisco. Subject to change. We will keep you posted. But so far, that's the plan, because there will be an Inter-Intellect Arena Magazine conversation. And I think we will have some very exciting programming there and some partying to indulge in, and of course to live with the magazine under your arms. I think it's going to be, if it's as beautiful as the previous ones, it's going to be a work of art. In the last section, I like to talk with my guests about what gives them hope. Usually we just talk about, unexpected things that seem already obvious to you. But in your case, almost 2 years ago, you wrote an incredible piece in the Free Press, maybe one of the first really viral pieces on Barry Weiss's excellent online magazine. I'm 23 years old and I've bought a farm. Those people who, or those of us who follow you on X, sometimes you post photos of your cooking. Sometimes the cooking is of Hungarian dishes. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm very, very anal when it comes to the consistency of different soups and sauces. We can have one day, an entire podcast episode just about this. We can actually cook on the podcast and go fully Julia Child. This is an incredible piece, a memoir that you wrote. And despite everything you are describing in it, it is full of hope. Often the brightest light of hope comes really from the darkest places. because that's where you really realize its value and its core utility to our staying alive, basically. I would love for you to talk a little bit about this piece and how you ended up buying a farm and what farms have to do with hope.
Well, my twin brother died in August of 2022, and it was literally in the days following that where I was just sort of going crazy that I started looking at land listings. This is something that I'd always thought about doing, and there was a little 25-acre parcel 40 minutes from my house that I had that had popped up. I called the broker and I went down there. I forgot to take pictures when I was there the first time. It was sort of 6:30, 7 in the evening, sunset, and it was like extremely beautiful. We walked the whole area, and there was no service in the once you start walking down the hill on the farm. And I got back in the car and there was still no service. And then there was like a thunderstorm that started, but there was this crazy rainbow in front of all of the thunderclouds. And I tried calling my mom, but there was no service. And finally I get service, but then I'm 10 minutes away from my house and I walk in the door and I was like, we have to call the bank. So I bought the farm. And I don't really have anything interesting to say about hope in that context other than that it's all we have.
Tell me about farming. Do you farm your land yourself? You are based in Austin.
We have apples.
You have
We don't farm for like corn or soybeans or whatnot. We have apples, plums. We're planting a lot of flowers. We'll eventually plant various gardens, and we're going to plant a vineyard. But right now, apples is the big commitment.
And how often do you go back?
I'm trying to spend a lot of the summer there. That's the goal. And it's sort of the best time to be there anyway, the sort of summer and the autumn. But I have a business to run as well, and
Yes.
as much as I'd like to, not the greatest decision in the world to try to run that type of business from a farm in Iowa. Even though with my new Starlink internet, I can.
That would make a really good to go back to a traditional journalism New York Times story, running a major business from a little farm whilst plums and apples.
Well, this is one of the jokes that I tell is I tweeted out a picture of my like off-grid cabin that has a little typewriter in it and oil lanterns. And I said, this is where I write pro-technology propaganda from. And that's sort of my techno-Luddism, print technology magazine, go analog to communicate the pro-tech message. But I think what people don't necessarily want is like to wake up with 100 email newsletters in their inbox and 100 Spotify notifications and this sort of like siege on their time. We just thought, I don't know, let's go analog. Let's go vintage. Let's do a print magazine. Let's do books. People love the physical.
Yeah, to spend the time. This is the Kevin Kelly thing in What Technology Wants, right? His years or decades in a cabin. That's where you really start seeing technology not as kind of a somatic experience, not part of yourself, but as something that you can objectify and understand and maybe build better.
Well, there are lots of things that are technology. And I think that one of the technologies that are going to lose over the next, decades are the ones that take your time away. We're going to prioritize the technologies that give us our time back. And that's sort of the techno-Luddite thesis is technology is great because it makes us wealthier. It gives us our time back. And there are certain people who do very sort of self-sacrificial things, but that there's nothing that inspiring about like technology that takes people's times away, like, Wi-Fi toaster or whatnot. Wi-Fi toaster seems like a hassle. Let's go back to the other thing. Wi-Fi refrigerator seems like a hassle. And so I don't know, I'd like to have a society that's so wealthy that it can become a luxury for everyone to unplug more than we do. Because like the panopticon version of things where everything's connected and it's like China and you have to fill out all your forms on your phone and be glued to it is not very inspiring. But if we can have a sort of tech-enabled low-tech future where people can live in nice neighborhoods and have prosperous lives where they don't have to look at phones all day or be stuck in office cubicles, then that's very good to me.
That's our hope agenda. I think that's a really, really good place to arrive at. Max Meyer, thank you so much for coming. on the hope axis. I think you gave us a lot of hope in this conversation. And thank you, everybody, for listening and watching us. This is such a privilege for me to be able to, have these conversations with these amazing people. Continue watching, continue listening. Thank you so much.